Commission to order. The first item of business is citizen comments. Do we have anybody on the phone or on Zoom, Rita, that is interested in sharing comments?
I do see one hand up. Okay, I'm going to allow you to talk and you have 3 minutes. You're good to go.
Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. I'm David Morton. I live near Redmond. The Cadman asphalt facility in Kenmore has been pouring tons of hazardous air pollutants into the air breathed by its neighbors. These hazardous air pollutants have been and will be affecting the health of many people, including hundreds of residents, employees of businesses, people walking and biking on Burke-Gilman Trail, and shoppers at stores. Among the hazardous air pollutants emitted by asphalt plants like Cadman are ethylbenzene, formaldehyde, toluene, xylene, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. Here's some information about the effects of breathing these toxic chemicals. Ethylbenzene is classified as a possible carcinogen. Acute short-term exposure to ethylbenzene in humans results in respiratory effects such as throat irritation and chest constriction, irritation of the eyes, and neurological effects such as dizziness. Formaldehyde exposure is a significant consideration for human health. Formaldehyde is known to be a human carcinogen. Formaldehyde is highly toxic to all animals. Formaldehyde can be toxic, allergenic, and carcinogenic. Formaldehyde can irritate the eyes and mucous membranes, may cause headaches, a burning sensation in the throat, difficulty breathing, and can trigger or aggravate asthma symptoms. Inhaling toluene has potential to cause severe neurological harm, can cause tiredness, confusion, weakness, drunken type actions, memory loss, nausea, loss of appetite, and hearing and color vision loss. Breathing xylene vapors in small amounts can cause headache, dizziness, drowsiness, and nausea. With more serious exposure, xylene can cause sleepiness, stumbling, irregular heartbeat, fainting, or even death. Xylene vapors are irritating to the eyes, skin, and lungs. Sulfur dioxide irritates the skin and mucous membranes of the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. High concentrations of sulfur dioxide can cause inflammation and irritation of the respiratory system, especially during heavy physical activity. Elevated levels of nitrogen dioxide can cause damage to the human respiratory tract and increase a person's vulnerability to and the severity of respiratory infections and asthma. Long-term exposure to high levels of nitrogen dioxide can cause chronic lung disease. When you get a whiff of the stench from Cadman, you're breathing these chemicals. No one is regulating or monitoring this company's emissions of these poisons into the air that people are breathing. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, David. Rita, do we have anybody else present to share comments that we are aware of?
Yes, if you give me one moment, I see one more hand up. Okay, Vicki, your 3 minutes starts now.
Thank you. I'm Vicki Grayland and I live in Kenmore. I want to support David Morton's message. I think it's very important, and it's very important to the health of many of our citizens who have endured this for many years. For my own comments, I would like to say I would encourage the Planning Commission to fast track issues of the tree canopy. I live on 73rd, and once again, I'm driving down my street and I'm seeing mature trees being taken down for development. I don't quite understand why the city or why even a developer cannot understand that to buy a house with mature trees makes it more valuable. And it certainly is more valuable to our community as we fight climate change. Trees are one of our most important methods of fighting climate change. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vicky. Anyone else, Rita, or is Vicky the last person?
Vicky looks like our last person.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much. Okay. The next item of business is approval of the minutes for the February 16th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. Do I have a motion for such?
Mark,
Yes, Dwight.
I'm not exactly sure what the process for this is for this planning commission, but I would like to ask for excuse from the last meeting. I did try to dial in and I made several attempts, and it probably is my fault, but I think that Rita and Debbie can tell you that I tried. I would appreciate the Planning Commission's willingness to give me an excuse for last meeting.
That is certainly fine by me. We all know stuff happens with technology these days. So as far as the process goes, perhaps Rita or Lori or Debbie can share, but we certainly would like to, I guess, have that noted for the record for last meeting and possibly even for the minutes of last meeting. Any suggestions from our staff on how to handle that?
Either way is appropriate. If you'd like the minutes to be amended, you could make a motion to do so. It's not necessary, but if that's helpful for clarification, that's certainly fine.
I'm certainly fine if somebody wants to make, how would this work in terms of approving the minutes? Would we approve the minutes as so amended?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess we still need a motion for the minutes.
So I move that I be excused due to technical difficulties from the last meeting, and that this be shown in the minutes.
Okay, do we have a second for that?
Second.
Second, okay. Rita, do we need a roll call vote for that, or just will a voice vote suffice for this?
I believe we need a roll call vote.
Okay, so why don't you go ahead and, when you're ready to do that, please.
Okay, give me 1 second. Commissioner Banazinski,
Yes. Approved.
Commissioner Lutzis,
Yes.
Commissioner Vanderline,
Yes.
Commissioner Greathouse,
Yes.
Chair Orenshaw,
Yes.
Commissioner Thompson.
Yes, and thank you for your consideration.
So now I believe, so amended, do we go ahead and approve the amended minutes then?
I so move as Mark has recommended.
Okay, so can I have a second for the approval of the amended minutes then?
Second.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and second. Any discussion on approval of the minutes from February 16th as amended? Hearing none, why don't we go ahead and call the roll again, please, Rita?
Okay, Commissioner Orenshaw.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you.
That's all you. It's all good.
Okay, Commissioner Vanderline.
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Lutzis,
Yes.
Commissioner Greathouse,
Yes.
Commissioner Banazinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Thompson.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay, we've now approved the minutes as amended. So our next agenda item is the land use and housing element updates, including missing middle. So invite our city staff, Lori and Debbie, to join us for that. So take it away.
Well, this evening we're continuing the background discussion for the land use and housing element. This is to give you enough context to be able to have those discussions and understand some of the technical issues that you might be asked to take on. So we thought it was important that you had that background. So Laurie is going to step through the memo, the background information, and then we're here to answer any questions.
Great. Good evening. So as Debbie said, I have 4 things to talk about this evening. One is missing middle housing and what is happening in other jurisdictions, some of our surrounding jurisdictions and others, about missing middle housing. Second, we have information on the city's transit-oriented development district. We call it the TOD for short. Third, we're going to talk generally about how development intensity is expressed. I think this might be useful as we begin to talk about different levels of both commercial and residential development. And then lastly, we have some follow-up information that you requested at your last meeting. So with that, I will start by talking about the missing middle housing. Again, this is all by way of background, and we're doing that so that you have kind of a grounding where we and other places are with regard to some of these topics, and we hope this will be useful as we move forward into the policy discussion. So the table, attachment 1 to your packet, was a table showing how missing middle is handled in other jurisdictions. And the housing types, we didn't include every missing middle housing type. If you recall from your early January meeting, there was an illustration of different missing middle housing types, and it ranged all the way up to courtyard apartments and I think live-work units, levels of density that we are not anticipating covering through this project. So what I've provided in the table is an analysis of duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, and cottage housing. Cottage housing, they're small, independent units that may be on a single property. And so it just looks like you have a development of very small units surrounding a courtyard typically. And that was something that the City Council had mentioned, and that language appears in the housing strategy plan. So I did include information about cottage housing. And as you can see, looking at the table, the state, both in the state of Oregon and the state of Washington, has started to take a real interest in this, and we'll see what comes out of this year's legislative session. Last year, 2 years ago, it was a kind of a 2-year process, they put some standards in place that if cities supported this type of development, then cities would not need to face an appeal about that. That was a way perhaps to make it easier. And then several of our surrounding jurisdictions allow at least some component of missing middle. Bothell just, I think a week and a half ago, authorized duplexes on corner lots in their community. Kenmore already allows townhouses. I'm not sure you knew that, but you can do a townhouse in Kenmore in a single family zone if you get what's called a conditional use permit that has specific criteria and a public hearing. So 2 approaches, if you read through the material, there are generally 2 approaches that places have taken. One is to do sort of a blanket approach, regardless of what type of unit it is, but whatever it is, it's allowed throughout single family zoning districts. And the other approach has been to, in fact, develop a new zoning district that's targeted for certain locations. So I just wanted to point that out and to ask if the commission has any immediate reactions to those 2 strategies, or whether you have questions about the information provided. And I may not know all the details from another jurisdiction, but I can certainly track that down for you.
Hey, Laura, can I maybe start with a clarifying question on Kenmore Townhomes? So they're
Yeah.
currently, again, in all residential single-family units with a conditional use permit. There's no other
Correct.
restrictions other than that.
No, they would still have the density limitations. So you
Oh.
couldn't do you still would have to comply with the density rules,
Okay.
but you could do that housing type with a conditional use permit.
Right. Okay. Do you have any, just for our kind of maybe background context, how many townhomes currently exist in single-family zones?
I don't know how many historically exist. I don't have that information. I know there are attached projects in the city's single-family zoning districts. We investigated that several years ago when we were looking sort of generally where affordable housing was. In terms of using this code provision, I know of only one development, and it has come forward in like the past year to take advantage of this opportunity. But the code provision itself, as far as I know, in Kenmore's history since incorporation, has not previously been used.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So do you want to just open it up to some thoughts on the two approaches now? Is that?
Yeah, if
you're
you have,
thinking?
and you may not be ready to, I'm not asking for a commitment. I'm just interested in which approach from your perspectives seems more practical or preferable.
Lori, I have
city.
a question related to Mark's question. How long have townhomes been allowed in single-family zones in Kenmore?
Since incorporation, so 1998. I mean, I think that was a standard adopted from King County before incorporation. This same code section used to allow certain types of apartments also in single family. Again, adopted from incorporation. But several years ago, there was a concern expressed about that provision and it was removed. I can't remember exactly what year, but it was, I think, 2014, 2015, something like that.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Commissioner Vanderline.
Yes, just express an initial preference, much more to learn, I'm sure, to weigh, but tying the missing middle to TOD, I think has some attraction to it, seeing as we actually will be achieving mutual goals here in terms of wanting to create density around a transit area, which is one of the requirements or preferences within the Growth Management Act, as well as within the TOD. So I think looking at that, we already did quite a bit of work on the TOD area and looking at mixed use, multifamily use within that region. So, but I think that makes a lot of sense. I do have a practical question, which has kind of been bugging me for a while. I've been thinking about the missing middle. Given the level of maturity of our single-family neighborhoods, am I correct in assuming that if a developer wanted to do a townhouse, a duplex, triplex, something of that nature within the existing single-family areas, they would have to acquire the existing single families and come together with a consolidated lot of multiple units and then remove those existing housing to be able to put in the new housing?
No, not necessarily.
Help me understand, what's the alternative? How would you do that?
Well, so presumably there is vacant property still in the city. We know that to be true from our capacity analysis. And I don't know specifically what sizes are there. But there are a couple different ways to approach missing middle housing. One would be to reduce lot sizes. So then, for example, if you had a lot of a certain size, you could subdivide it and put in a second house. Another approach for duplexes and triplexes would be to allow an increased density, or it could be a situation, as you have mentioned, if you were already at your maximum density, then you would have to potentially consolidate. But I'm not sure why someone would do that. You know, if there were no, for example, if you had 3 single-family lots that were already at the minimum lot size, to take down the 3 existing houses and put in a triplex would not make a lot of sense, I wouldn't
Right.
think. But I do think there are other ways to approach missing middle. Again, lot size is one way. Looking at density requirements is another way.
That's good, and that's where I was trying to get to. So at some point, I'd like to do some discovery on what the practicality of this is. You know, what really is the vacant land situation that would be available for this type of development in the city, and where is it? And what are some, and you talk about some of the other options of having some sort of subdivision, increasing density. If that's was a route we were willing to go down within the single family neighborhood, it'd be good to understand some more about those.
Right. So one thing we'll be looking at in probably in April, late April, is the city's capacity analysis. So we'll have information. We already have it, but we've turned it into King County, and King County is the one who does the final report. But we'll have information on how much vacant land there is and sort of what the redevelopment capacity is under the existing zoning.
Good, thank you.
Commissioner Lutzis.
To address the question, I guess initial preferences for myself would be the second option, or the one that Seattle uses about a targeted zoning for missing middle housing. And I guess my thinking behind that is, you know, we kind of discussed the benefits of targeted density building, especially in our discussions recently with affordable housing. And so I think keeping on that track, I can see the appeal of that and how it's a little more structured than opening it up completely as of right now. Of course, this is subject to change as we discuss this. And, you know, if there's more benefits for the other, then I'm definitely willing to change my preference. But that's just my preference as of right now.
Commissioner Thompson.
So I feel toward the approach of zoning districts, and I only suggest that right now because, first of all, we don't have all of the data to really look at. Number one is how much is our availability and where it is. Secondly, I think that we need to consider the issue of our environmental protections and how this all balances out. And then, you know, looking at the TOD option, I think that needs to be taken into consideration and balanced. And I think there's room to move here, but I just don't want to see us move too fast and not have all the information that we need to be able to justify it, not only to the council, but to our citizens, so that we can explain it with a straight face of why we are proposing what we're proposing. That's my view.
Why don't we go start with Commissioner Greathouse and then go to Commissioner Banasinski.
I'm also in favor of the new zoning district as well. We've talked about wanting to preserve the integrity of the single family neighborhoods. I also am in favor of the transit district, the building in that area, and I think those are complementary.
Great. Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. I don't have an initial strong preference. I feel like I've got a lot to learn and I have a lot of learning to do. My initial feelings on both were that I think there's a certain aesthetic appeal to having a gradual transition from multifamily zoning, housing, big apartment complex in our single family zoning. So that's aesthetically very appealing to me, that idea. I like that a lot, and it makes sense to put more people closer to more services and more transit. That all makes sense to me. I did wonder, however, whether that's the most equitable way to distribute housing in our community. So I had that thought. I also feel incredibly concerned about our critical areas and protecting our environment for climate stability into the future. And I wonder what the effects of placing middle missing housing in certain zoning areas, what that would do for our environment and climate. Maybe it would be better to have them consolidated closer to the TOD. Maybe it would be better for our environment to have them spread out. I'm not really sure, but that's something that I'm thinking about as well.
All right.
Well, I would kind of echo, I'll just go ahead next, echo sort of, at least initially and from a conceptual level, the zoning districts. I think to sort of, initiate this on a citywide basis, especially not knowing, not having really a clear idea of how much the community would support that. Like Suzanne mentioned, it's a, pretty significant, or indicate a pretty significant change to the single family zone. So, if there was a way to sort of target it and do some kind of trial period, maybe in specific geographies, it does make sense. I agree to do it, as close as feasible to commercial and transit areas. I was particularly interested in to see that it looked like both Kirkland and Tacoma did some form of sort of demonstration project before they moved to a more permanent basis. So obviously Kirkland has a lot more in common with us than Tacoma. And I just wondered if, at some point, not necessarily tonight, if we could get some idea of how their process went, what they learned as they went from that sort of demonstration to a more permanent base. I think would be very helpful for us to find out more information about. So I guess one other consideration, is, if we started targeted, we wouldn't make as much of a dent in affordable housing, obviously, if it was, targeted to specific areas. But I think, the other side of that is, you'd have, I think, more support by starting it on a smaller sort of trial basis and seeing how it works, and, hopefully garner community support in that fashion. So anybody else care to share any thoughts about? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just an additional thing. We're going to get into the weeds here pretty quick. Before we do, I think I'd really like to have a common consensus on what it is we're really trying to accomplish. We've talked about density, we talk about affordability. What does affordability mean in this context? I don't think it's going to be the lower end. It's probably going to be challenging to build even at the middle. So what is that, and how do we weigh off, or how, as a commission, how do we feel? What's the trade-off here? Density versus affordability versus community acceptance standards. I'd like to make sure we understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, so we know whether we're successful or not at some point, and be able to weigh some of those alternatives. I hope we don't fall into, well, the Growth Management Act says, so we got to do this. That's not going to be sufficient, at least for me personally. I think we need to understand what it is that we want as Kenmore. So anyway, it would be nice to have a common understanding a little bit better of what those principles are, so that as we get into this, we can start evaluate this against some common set of goals and principles.
All right, any more thoughts? Lori, are you looking for more thoughts again on this sort of, at least the, this initial impressions, or do you have enough?
No, I this is going to be a long conversation. It just helps me to have sort of a general initial understanding of issues, concerns, information that would be helpful. Again, this is all in preparation. We're nowhere close to being able to make decisions, and we want certainly to involve the public probably before we go too far. So Anyway, so it's just by way of background information that you can hold until we're ready to talk about more concrete policy options.
Commissioner Lutzis, go ahead.
Kind of tying in with our discussion last meeting, I believe, about goals that we were discussing about putting on for a community survey. And one of those, we were discussing the wording of, I believe it said protecting single family kind of residents and whatnot, but we kind of played with the words there. Anyway,
Yeah.
The idea was there in that goal. And so maybe we'd have a little more understanding of which direction we want to take, depending on where that goal lines up as a priority listed by the citizens. So maybe that survey might help us in the future, at least picking which kind of option at least our citizens want. Just going forward, just something to keep in mind.
Right. Okay.
I was going to say, this is very, the other reason that we're asking these questions, giving you this information right now, is the feedback that you give us as planning commissioners, but also as residents of the community, will be very helpful in when we have that discussion about the public participation plan and the survey, because some of the questions or issues that you're raising are probably going to reflect what we'll hear from the community. So that's the other reason of having this conversation early. We haven't got a public participation plan yet, or know how that participation plan will play into the survey. So again, this is just background context, more to come.
Great.
Okay, so the other piece of background information has to do with the TOD and just sort of some general information about it. So this was an interesting process. So over several years, a couple of years, I guess, there was a group similar to the Planning Commission called the Downtown Task Force that was appointed by the City Council. And they were the ones that, with consultant help, developed the TOD standards. And so the goal of the TOD obviously was to support transit, to provide a more walkable area, to increase density supportive of transit. And then there were several corollary features, one of which was that there was a requirement that affordable housing be provided. It addressed parking, it addressed to some extent tree preservation. There were design standards that were applied. Anyway, through the course of the TOD, basically a new zoning district was created. But the interesting thing is that it is up to the person owning, developing the property to decide whether they want to stick with the current zoning, we call that the underlying zoning, or whether they want to use the TOD zoning. Now, the attraction, of course, of the TOD is the significant density increase. Probably someone who did not want to do any affordable housing would not be interested necessarily in the TOD. But we included the map. It stretches basically from 73rd along Bothell Way out to the eastern edge of the city. And as part of the update to the land use element, this was something that was specifically called out to look at the TOD and to decide, are the boundaries the right boundaries? The ultimate boundaries were not adopted until 2015, I think it was. And there was a gap. The City Council received all the recommendations for the TOD, but then they asked that the project be put on hold until the Planning Commission made some recommendations on the zoning along 522. And then they adopted the boundaries, which were different actually than what the task force had originally recommended. And so now the question is, given that bus rapid transit is presumably headed to Kenmore, should the TOD be extended further along 522? Should we give up the idea of optional zoning and just say you're in the TOD and you have to develop that way, there is a minimum density requirement in the TOD, which is also significant. So that's something to think about. And then the question of whether that, if it is extended and we did want to support TOD development, should some sort of a minimum be mandatory? And is it the same minimum that is currently mandatory? So questions about the TOD?
Are you wanting input on those questions, or are you just asking for more, information about?
Yeah, if you have questions, what I'm hoping is that you have kind of an understanding of what the TOD is.
Mhm.
You know the kinds of questions that we'll be considering through the update, because that was specifically directed to us by the City Council.
Mhm.
And just be sort of familiar with it, and so in the future we can have a conversation.
Commissioner Rainwater.
Yes, the TOD concept has been out there in the public for a while. I'm wondering, Lori or Debbie, has there been any interest, or what level of interest has been expressed by developers? Has there been any change in the underlying property ownership? Are we seeing anything over here that's giving us an indication that the TOD incentives are attracting interest or attention?
So we had an inquiry early on. It was soon after the adoption of the final boundaries from a developer who was concerned that they did not think the incentives were such that it was going to make the project really feasible. And so the city then took on a program of multifamily tax exemption. And so for the TOD area, that incentive is in place. And so that transpired, I think, 2018, maybe. I know of one project that was coming in as a TOD project, and then COVID hit, basically. And the proponent said, oh, I don't want to do TOD after all. I'm going to go with a safer bet, which is townhomes. And actually, there's been quite a bit of concern expressed about that proposal, because here we are, our bus rapid transit is headed our way, and we're having a project right on SR 522 that's going to be townhomes, which is certainly the property owner's choice, but it did raise a question about, should we be more forcefully supporting a higher density development in the corridor.
I'd love to hear what the logic is behind, if developers are running away from higher density and the incentives that are already in the TOD and going to lower density townhouse type of development. Is there something we're missing here? Why is that? Our incentives seem to be disincentives.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was a disincentive to the TOD. It just was an easier approach. I mean, townhomes, as you know, have been sort of a hot new market.
Sure.
And so I'm not sure that the TOD has a lot of other corollaries, the affordable housing provision, the minimum density of 60 dwelling units per acre. That's a very high minimum density. So those things may just have made this person in this time change his or her mind. You know, we still have, transit is still several years out. I don't know. I can talk with development services and see if they have more information on why that choice was made.
Well, thank you. I have a feeling that whatever we learn here is going to be applicable to any other area of the city where we might want to put in a new zoning area. Just really understanding what it is the market wants to buy. And I think we want to be careful that we don't set ourselves up here for failure. And we understand, and of course I understand there's a time piece to this too, what may be in demand today may be something different 5, 10, 20 years down the line. But I think at least having an understanding of how the development community views the TOD and potentially would view some other type of new zoning within the city. How attractive is that? You know, what are the barriers for development? There's certainly development going on elsewhere outside of Kenmore. What is it that is attracting that type of development?
The other piece on this is that, in fact, this evening there is another meeting going on, hosted by Sound Transit, talking about the parking garage on 522. And the presentation to council that was also recently given was saying that there is interest in partnering with King County Metro on maybe including housing with the parking garage, or maybe looking if there's interest in adjoining property owners. So, you know, I think if housing is included in that project, that will be one of those things. I think it's always that thing, it's somebody's got to go first. And the market, the risk for a developer is whoever goes first to see if they're going to be successful. So I think, you know, if there is housing with that transit project, I think that will probably maybe stimulate some other development along the corridor there as well. As far as the developer that chose townhomes, I'm sure it's market driven. He would probably see a faster return on his investment for townhomes than holding out for multifamily. The question for the city though is, do you want to have it more market driven, or if you really think that having a TOD and the level of density along the transit corridor, we may have to wait a little while for the market to catch up. So I think that's sort of the underlying question for this is, if we really want that high transit capacity corridor to reflect higher density, we may have to wait a little while. And if we feel that's appropriate, then maybe that's where we consider not allowing the underlying zoning to have something like a townhouse development. Maybe we want that higher density. So I think those are some of the underlying sort of policy questions that will have to be addressed.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think that goes back to what is it we want to get out of this? Again, I think it comes back to are we long-term, are we looking for density? Are we looking for affordability? What is it? Because obviously, well, obviously, but apparently there are some short-run decisions we could make that would have some short-run development, but is that really what we want long-term? I think that's a discussion I'm sure we'll have, and a discussion we'll want to at least ask or have with the community.
Right. And I might point out, you had mentioned that you know, GMA is not the place for you to get your direction. I can appreciate that. But I will say that the Vision 2050 and the countywide planning policies do tell us certain things about what direction we should be heading. And we have to be consistent with those. And there is a certification process. So that it's not a complete free-for-all. That's what I can say. For example, Kenmore could not decide they wanted to be rural. That would not work. This is an extreme.
No, I understand that, Lori, completely. I just would be disappointed, but understand if we were going into a check off the box routine without thinking about what does this really mean, and what are the true goals and objectives we want to have, and how does the planning we do support that?
Right.
It'd be easy to go through, very easy to go through and come up with some language that would tick off the boxes and move on. But I'm hoping that's not where we're going.
I don't think that's where we're going.
Commissioner Thompson, go ahead.
Well, a couple of things. I agree with the check off the box problem. The issue, though, that I think we're going to have is where are we going to draw lines? I think that's where we're headed in that direction. And but I guess, and I'm not completely up to date on the TOD. So if you could give me a 1 to 3 minute hit really quickly about the tax advantage that they didn't want? And what are we paying our developers to do? I guess that's the bottom line.
Yeah, so the tax advantage was something that they did want. It's called the multifamily tax exemption. And if you build a multifamily project, then you get a certain number of years of tax exemption. And if you include affordable housing, you get even more years of tax exemption. So it's a benefit.
From the city and the county, correct?
Pardon me?
That's both from city and county taxes then.
Yeah, I believe so. It's the property tax. So I'm assuming that the rate goes down and it affects all of the other districts that receive components. And I know Debbie will jump in and tell me if I'm not correct on that, but
okay,
that is the case.
That's correct. We can also provide you a link maybe to the area section in the municipal code, so you can kind of read those details about the multifamily tax exemption. That would be great, just so I can understand it literally, because some citizen and constituent is going to ask this question, and I feel the responsibility to be able to answer it in 1 or 2 sentences, because that's what we're supposed to do, and because they're going to ask why. So they don't want to do multifamily, so you're not. Yeah, you know, there's so many ways of looking at this, and a lot of it I do believe is back to what Mike and some of the other of us have talked about. This is a lot about drawing lines. I mean, where do we want our development and our city to look like in 20, 30, 40 years? And what we do today is going to make a difference. Or not tonight, but in sometime this year.
Yeah. Hey, sort of building on that point, which I think is really good. So obviously there's been a huge amount of redevelopment, probably since the TOD was, do you say 2015, Lori? Was that the TOD's?
I think that's when the boundaries and they adopted the whole thing altogether.
And since that time, I think, can't remember the exact timing, but all those new units, multifamily, have gone in downtown. What effect would extending the TOD to presumably include, I guess, more of what might be considered downtown, would that potentially have? I guess where might the potential be if the TOD was, geographically and otherwise, if the TOD was extended, I guess, further, would that be further west from where it is?
Right. I think, when the TOD was done, bus rapid transit wasn't a glimmer in anyone's eyes. So now times have changed, and Kenmore is a high capacity transit community. So the city could consider, there are stations at 61st and at 68th and at the Park and Ride. So the 2 of those aren't in the TOD, and the TOD was not extended to downtown, thinking that the existing zoning for downtown was adequate. Mm-hmm. So I think some consideration could be given to the whole corridor. I'm not suggesting necessarily that it be extended along the whole corridor, but it's certainly something we should talk about. Or if there's a portion of the corridor where it makes sense, maybe in the general vicinity of one of those other stations. I think that was the idea.
Okay. Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. Conceptually, it makes sense to me to think about extending the TOD over other areas on 522. So if we want to think about where it might make sense to put more density. I don't know if that means the whole way or if that means leapfrogging over certain other areas, but at least conceptually it makes sense to consider it. And I know that either Lori or Debbie, that you did talk about this in one of our recent meetings, but can you talk again about how they decided how far up 522 to go? Because I noticed that it jumps way up on 73rd. It's goes way further north than it does in other parts right now. Can you remind me about why that is or how that was decided?
Yeah, I think that was following a zoning line. And the interesting thing about those parcels along 73rd is that the reason it looks like such a huge block is that those parcels are really big, and the back half of those parcels are in the Swamp Creek wetland.
Yeah.
And so really the zoning that's impacted is right up against 73rd. It's a very small portion of those properties. But it looks like it's, for some reason, it's gone way back into the neighborhoods, and that is not the case. It just happens to be that the lot configurations right there are such that by capturing the small area along 73rd that could be TOD, it also picks up the back half of those parcels, which are not developable.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, because I know this wasn't necessarily the direction this conversation was going, but I did notice that when I was looking at
Yeah,
it.
sure. It's a very strange pattern.
Yeah, and I did notice that they were all zoned single family, and I did notice that that all through North Kenmore, those single family, like one home single family lots, one home per acre, they seem to follow Swamp Creek. Is that right?
Yeah, in fact, it's zoned that way.
Yeah.
Because of Swamp Creek.
Mm-hmm.
And the zoning standards set out the fact that even though you have a large parcel, you can only cluster your development up against the street.
Okay, yeah, I was feeling protective of Swamp Creek when I looked
Yes.
at it. Yeah, that's good here. I think I'd like us to be mindful about that as we're going forward too. That's like I know we've experienced a lot of flooding problems already, especially down by 73rd in that corridor. And so I think, and a lot of that flooding is because of how we've developed along that corridor. So I think it would be good to be mindful about that moving forward too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I like the flow of the recent conversation. I think, Mark, your idea of asking the question about extending the TOD, I think that's an interesting question. Maybe we ought to be thinking about the extension of the TOD and the missing middle is actually separate considerations, because I can see there could be some excellent reasons for thinking about extending the TOD, particularly given some of the overlap between the goals of the downtown commercial and downtown residential districts. And that's where our transit's going to be, and that's where we really have always wanted density to be. So maybe treating this as a single zoning unit may be helpful. Once we make some decisions about that and understand it, then I think we could be thinking about how does that correlate with our missing middle questions. Going back to some of the earlier discussions that I think Tracy brought up about if you have your density along 522 and you have your transit already built in, looking at the districts behind that as a potential for the missing middle, getting the type of property I think is generally back there now, that might be an opportunity to be able to develop the entire area in a coordinated and planned way.
Okay. Are there?
Oh, go ahead, Nathan.
I agree with that. Oh, thank you. I agree with Commissioner Vanderline, and actually that was something that was crossing my mind right before you said that as well. But a quick clarifying question for Lori and maybe Debbie is, I see a lot of prohibitions in the TOD district overlay for allowances, and some of those I think may conflict with businesses already there. And could you speak to that and why that is and why these prohibitions were selected for the way they are?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So in every zoning district, you have certain uses that are permitted, you have certain uses that are conditionally permitted, and then you have uses that are prohibited. And typically what you're trying to do is talk about the degree or level of intensity of a particular kind of use, and then decide whether that use is too much for an area. For example, heavy manufacturing is something that's not even permitted anywhere in Kenmore. That's not just not permitted. I don't know if you had a specific use in mind, but if a use is pre-existing and it continues, it's what's called a non-conforming use. It doesn't meet the standard. And in the case of a TOD, actually a non-conforming use probably wouldn't come up, because if you're doing the TOD, you're doing a new development and you're going to remove presumably the existing use. It would be more likely to come up in the underlying zoning. And I can give you a good example. When the urban corridor zoning was created several years ago, there were some auto repair businesses in that area. The decision was that auto-oriented businesses were not desirable along the corridor. There was a desire to convert it from basically an auto-oriented strip to something else. So those auto repair businesses became non-conforming. That didn't mean that they had to move out. It just means that, for example, they couldn't expand greatly. They could continue their existing operation, but they're not the preferred use. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you had a specific something in mind.
I guess what I had in mind were the specific allowances of transportation and vehicle refueling stations.
Yeah, gas station.
Gas stations, yes, because I guess my thinking was that there's already a couple there. And I guess if we're going to be increasing the density quite greatly in a certain area, that those might be necessary in that local area. But I mean, I don't,
Right. Again, with the TOD, it's an unusual case where you have this table in an overlay zone over an underlying zone. For example, in the underlying zone, urban corridor zone, there is an allowance for a gas station, one of those pre-existing gas stations at a specific corner. The TOD says gas stations are not permitted, but a TOD development would never come in that would have a gas station as a component. That doesn't, it just wouldn't happen. TOD has to be a mixed use development. It has to include housing. And so you would never develop under the TOD rules if you were interested in a gas station. You just wouldn't do that. Now, what it does raise, Nathan, is a really interesting question, which is that if the Planning Commission ultimately decided that the TOD was going to become the permanent zoning, it wasn't going to be an overlay anymore, it was going to be the new zoning, then those questions would have to be revisited, because it wouldn't be an overlay zone, it would be the outright zone. And for example, the gas station that I just cited, we probably would have to think about, well, maybe that is an appropriate use, and we would have to write it into the TOD in a different way. So that was a good catch there, good catch.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's where my head was already, was considering that potential option of if we did make this permanent, reevaluating maybe some of those prohibitions. But thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, well, thanks for raising the question. It's a good one. So
one more thought about the significant tree grove retention that's part of the TOD, especially in light of Vicki Grayland's comment tonight about being concerned about tree canopy. I know it's something I hear from community members quite a bit, that they're concerned about tree canopy. And I know that it's been addressed at various levels even recently by the Planning Commission and the City Council, but it keeps coming up. And so I feel like maybe there's something more to be addressed there. And I wonder, is it possible for us to address a component of that through this significant tree grove retention in the TOD language, or is this already set?
Well, it's similar to the question about permitted and prohibited uses. I would not think that revamping the whole TOD approach, I think that would be sort of going off on a tangent if suddenly we were delving into tree issues exclusively for the TOD. However, if the rules became permanent, of course the question could be asked, should that tree grove retention incentive remain? And I know early on there was some consideration, I think with the whole missing middle housing discussion about should there be an incentive related to missing middle related to tree preservation. Again, we do not on our docket have a charge to do anything with trees. That is not on our docket for this year. There may be areas at the margin where the interplay between density and tree preservation could come up and be discussed, but that's not a broad charge. That would be a limited analysis of a density change.
Yeah,
and I don't know, Debbie.
Wouldn't ask us to sneak in and do, a whole tree canopy revision here, but I was just wondering what the opportunities are to think about differently how we're preserving trees, if there's any room here.
Yeah, I think, there's a fundamental question, and this is one that you all raised when you looked at goals. A tree preservation goal and a density increase goal, both of which have to do with environmental protection. That is a hard conflict. And so, yes, there may be opportunities to think about how the two interrelate, but they conflict. And they both are protective environmentally. So it gets down to what is the greater priority.
So this is sort of a slight tangent, but I'm going to take it. So that's how the trees would, as Laurie pointed out, would be sort of as part of the Planning Commission's charge. Just as a piece of information, on April 19th, the Development Services Department are having a study session with the City Council talking about the tree regulations and tree preservation. So if any of you are interested in that topic, that might be a good council meeting to attend to understand what the current regulations are around trees. So that's sort of the first step. But currently it's not on the work program to take a look at revising the tree regulations sort of citywide. But I'm just kind of throwing that in there that their council is getting some more information about tree regulations on April 19th.
Thank you, Debbie. That's good to know. Question, if and when we get into design criteria related to missing middle, would that be a place we might have some discussions about tree preservation?
Again, the question of whether incentives related to missing middle could relate to trees, that's already, I think that someone, a city council member may have raised that question. So I think that to some degree would be fair game.
Thank you.
Okay.
You need anything more from us on TOD at this point?
No.
Lori, doesn't sound like it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so the next sort of educational component that we thought we would bring forward tonight. This is a really small topic. It won't take a lot of time, but it was just providing an understanding of how density is controlled, both in Kenmore and in other places. And I think many of you know this, but Kenmore does have a couple of unique things. For one thing, density is regulated in 3 ways, not just in 2 ways. Kenmore has a maximum density, it has a base density, and it has a minimum density. Now, minimum density means that you cannot develop something lower. You can't develop fewer units, or I suppose if it were commercial, you can't develop a lower number of square feet than the minimum. And that minimum density is applied in the city's multifamily districts. It's historically been a way for a community to say, we want to densify an area, so you can't develop at something lower. Our example of townhomes on SR 522 in the TOD, if there were a minimum density, maybe those townhomes would not be developed because you would have to build too many of them and there wouldn't be room on the ground to put that many. So base density and maximum density are often confused. So base density is the maximum density you can achieve if you're just building a straight project. Maximum density is the base density, and then you can do incentives to get more units, and those are through a couple of different chapters, and there's special density incentives. And then, so the maximum density is how far you can go using those extra incentives. So does that make sense? Do you have questions about that? Okay, all right. Now, turning to commercial and development. So Kenmore doesn't use floor area ratio. And floor area ratio is also called FAR. And it's a way to look at square footage on a lot. And I included in your packet attachment number 4 that is kind of a depiction of how FAR works. It's the ratio between the floor area you want to put on a property and the size of the property. So 1 FAR means that you can build as much square footage as the same square footage as your lot size, okay, if there were no setbacks or anything else. So if you had a 20,000 square foot lot, you could build a 20,000 square foot building. And it doesn't mean you have to cover your whole lot. You can have 10,000 square feet on a floor, or you can have 5,000 square feet over 4 floors. It just is a way to express how big your building is. Now, Kenmore hasn't used that. We've just used setbacks and a maximum height, and you kind of end up in the same place. You say you have to have a 20-foot setback at the front and a 5-foot setback on the sides, and your maximum height is 60 feet. Okay, so that is going to define how big your building could be. But where FAR is useful is if you want to put in place a minimum. Okay, so you want to say you can't build less square footage, or you have to have a building of a certain size at a minimum. Now this has come up, and the reason I'm really talking about this is because there's been some question in parts of the downtown about whether the city would ever want to encourage a building that was more than a single story in height. So imagine, again, hypothetically, you have a 20,000 square foot lot, and you say your minimum FAR is 1.5. you've automatically said you have to build 30,000 square feet of commercial space. That has to go into 2 stories at least, because you don't have 30,000 square feet on your lot. Okay, so are you guys following this? Okay, well, there you go. This was this little educational component that I'm sure we will revisit, but I just wanted to talk about these different measurement techniques so you would be familiar with them. Okay. All right, well,
Oh, Commissioner Lucas has a question.
Not quite about the topic, but I'm just curious why this was included if Kenmore has never used FAR. Are there propositions that we might be looking at in the future where this might
I
come
think
up?
so. Yeah,
Okay.
there has been a question raised again about whether there should be certain parts of the city where a single-story building is no longer the best approach.
Okay.
That maybe we're to the point where we would like to have 2-story buildings at a minimum, something like that.
So we don't have anything yet, but it's on the horizon. It might be coming.
Right, it's up for discussion.
Thank you.
Just a hypothetical. When we think about FAR versus the sort of traditional setbacks we have in Kenmore today, is one approach versus another maybe more applicable to a commercial versus a residential area?
So some communities use FAR in residential areas more as a maximum than as a minimum. Again, Kenmore hasn't done that, but there are communities that do. Kirkland, I think, does that. They have a maximum FAR you can have on a residential lot, or at least in part of their residential areas. So do you want more information on use of FARs as a maximum?
Maybe not at this point, but if this does come back to us, I think we want to be asking ourselves a little bit about where is the most appropriate place to use this? Where is it most useful, specifically for Kenmore?
Okay.
I could see that if we were just hypothetical, suppose you had something like the TOD or something like downtown, where you were looking to concentrate your density, then maybe looking at something like FAR is a useful tool, hypothetically. But so if and when we were to get to that point, or the rumblings in the background become something we're ready to take a look at, I'd like to understand how this is used elsewhere and where it would be really useful as a tool versus where it might actually create unintended consequences, like in commercial versus residential area.
In residential areas, it's often used to prevent mega houses, for example.
Yep.
You put a maximum FAR on a project. So you are forcing a smaller size house on a lot.
So you could you potentially, or do we see in practice where cities would use FAR in some zoning districts and another approach elsewhere?
I don't know that off the top, but I'm not sure that, for example, that Kirkland uses FAR in all their residential zoning districts. I don't know that.
Right. So it's not a one or nothing.
Right, correct.
All
No.
or nothing. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Is it possible to combine maybe setbacks and FAR? Or is it kind of one or the other?
No, you could combine them. I mean, if you
Okay.
wanted to, you keep your setbacks, but then somehow limit the size of a house over the rest of the lot. If that's, yeah. And
Okay.
certainly in a commercial area, if you were doing a minimum FAR, you could still have setbacks, but it would just mean that your building potentially would have to be taller.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And would there be the potential for linking a concession based upon FAR linking it to preservation, for instance, of trees or natural habitat or some other public good?
So you're thinking that if you established, are you thinking of the minimum or the maximum?
Well, I was thinking you could maybe go either way. If if there was a significant habitat that you wanted to preserve on a site, and you could trade preserving that portion of the lot that had that habitat on, and in return they got a higher FAR that allowed them to build up rather than out.
Yeah, potentially. There are a couple things I want to be really careful about. One thing is critical areas and something like habitat.
Sure.
So critical area rules, they're established. They're not subject to waiver unless you have an unusual case where you can prove that you deserve a variance or a reasonable use exception. So it wouldn't ever be a case where we would be trading off building mass versus environmental protection. The rules are the rules for environmental protection. You have to protect your critical areas and provide your buffer, and only in unusual circumstances can you do something different. So we don't really have to give an incentive to somebody to protect their critical areas. That's not really the way it works.
Habitat was perhaps the wrong term to use. But if you have a significant tree canopy or a grove on a property, you could offer a higher or more favorable FAR to a developer if they agreed to preserve that tree grove or some other non-regulated or minimally protected.
Right. You could do that. You could do it through FAR, although it might just be easier to do that through height. So you would just say, if you're protecting this, you could go, instead of 35 feet, you can go to 40 feet or something like that. But all these sort of density height measures provide an opportunity for incentive as well as restrictions.
Yep.
So.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, then next to the last thing, actually the fourth thing I wanted to talk about was just the additional Kenmore information that you had requested. Last time we went over a couple of sheets worth of just sort of factual information from the American Community Survey and OFM and our other resources. And at that meeting, you flagged a number of things that you would like more information about. So we added into your memo information where we could find it. And there was still some housing information that Arch is collecting. And so we will be bringing that back to you probably at your next meeting, but not all of it was incorporated here. One really interesting thing, and I think that you all probably noticed this, was about how many people who live in Kenmore work in Kenmore, and that number was significantly different. And this wasn't like a pandemic thing. This was just different. So it will be interesting if we have the census information to see whether that really is the case. You know, the American Community Survey is like a 5-year average of a limited number of people. It's not like the census, which is like everybody gets counted and everybody provides their information. But that really jumped out at me. I thought that was very interesting.
So Laura, can you clarify, is that significant change higher in terms of a percentage of people who work in Kenmore?
Yeah, significant
change. Okay.
It was like 3% in 2015, and now it is the 2019 data was
13.9.
13.9, right? Yeah.
What I thought was really interesting there too is we've got about 14%, 13.9% of people who live in Kenmore work in Kenmore, and over 8% of those work at home. So half of our employment of Kenmore citizens is in their own home. I think that's probably a trend that's going to grow over time. I think that seems to be what's in the
would think so.
literature.
Yeah.
I think that's something we really need to be thinking about, is we're thinking about economic development. And what do we do to encourage it? And where are we likely to be able to have an impact?
Yeah.
Helping people work at home in Kenmore, that creates maybe some economic advantage for the city, if we can figure out what those incentives are.
One other thought that comes to mind is that, the City Council asked the Planning Commission to consider commercial development at intersections in single-family neighborhoods. And you saw the article we included about accessory commercial units, but sort of the whole home-based businesses and how that relates to this notion of maybe some commercial in the neighborhoods, and whether there's an opportunity there. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, what would be very interesting to know is, of those 8.4% of residents who are working at home, what are they engaged in?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to move to the assumption that they've got a brewery or a coffee roasting, or they're doing something else. Looking again at the other statistic you have about what is the typical citizen of Kenmore look like, they're very highly educated professionals. So I suspect what they're doing in their homes and what they want to do in their homes and why they choose to live here probably has something to do with how their home allows them to be able to conduct a professional practice. Again, we need to know the numbers, but before we leap to let's build something at the intersections or have some, ancillary commercial units, that maybe that's not where the employment opportunity and the economic growth really is. It may be in keeping a city that's attractive to professionals who want to work at home. And that could look very different from what we might be offering either in a missing middle or in a high density situation or some sort of remote office development. But again, we don't have the data to know that. But it's curious to see what data we do have and what it does seem to be telling us.
So I just wanted to make a comment because I've attended a couple different sessions of the Business Accelerator programs, and that's mostly entrepreneurs who are working out of their homes in Kenmore. And one of the things that many of them were happy about was the hangar as a place to hold meetings related to their work. And then there were also a couple of businesses that were using the business incubator for the same kind of thing. And I actually have a home-based business, IT related, and I have a number of friends who work in Kenmore with similar kinds of jobs. And many of them, especially because of the pandemic, with all their kids at home and their significant others working on the computer and having a challenging time finding a quiet spot that's not the bathroom. I think that office space might be something, office space that you can sign up for and that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting, but I know that the number of folks that I've encountered in the Kenmore Business Alliance and some of the other business programs in this region are looking to work from home more and more.
I think, and I can check in to see if we have specific data about home-based businesses. We do have a business registration program, and it's possible that there may be some data there that we could capture. I think that the notion of the commercial at intersections sort of had to do with what's called a 15-minute neighborhood. So you could walk somewhere and get a cup of coffee, but maybe you walk somewhere to find a little office space. I don't know. We can, there's more to come on that topic. I haven't even scratched the surface of that one.
I suspect this is going to be an important one we're going to want to understand. I think there is a change that's going on here, both in the commercial side and also the way people make and where people make their livings. And if we understand what amenities that they're looking for, that might have some interesting input for us to be using as we look at our land use development.
Hey, Lori, really quick. So you said you remember it being at about 3% of residents who lived in Kenmore, worked in
I think
Kenmore?
so. Mhm.
Do you remember when that was from?
Well, we used that information for the 2015 comprehensive plan update. So I want to say that it was probably 2014 data, but I don't know that. Exactly.
So in 5 years, it jumped to 10%, roughly.
Well, if you, let's assume that it was 2014.
Mhm.
So 6, yeah, right.
Almost
That's
6%, wow.
amazing. It's an amazing change. That's
In,
why
in 5 years, yeah.
That's why I said, we'll wait for the census to see whether this really is the case.
Yes, but I think we're onto something about maybe, reevaluating our focuses if we see such tremendous growth so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's also two aspects of this that we have to keep in mind separately, though. One is those that are working from home because they're working from home versus those who are actually own and operating a business out of their home in Kenmore.
Yeah.
Because that requires a business license. And that's a whole, it's just a whole nother ball game compared to those of us that have been unfortunately stuck at home with everything going on around us and trying to find a private place other than the bathroom to have professional conversations. And so I think that it's going to be interesting as we go on with more data research, what's really happening. Are we seeing more business licenses opening up here in Kenmore, or are we just actually seeing more workers working from home? I don't know. I really don't know what the answer is to that.
That's an important question. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that the nature of work is changing, particularly when you're looking at people now having more options to be able to work remotely. And I think that changes a whole bunch of things, everything from transition or transit needs to what are the amenities that people are looking for. I'd also be interested in knowing if this is a trend that's happening in the surrounding communities. We're looking at this and saying, boy, this is really interesting. This is a really positive thing. But I wonder if some of the surrounding districts may actually have larger numbers. And are we trailing? Are we about what everybody is? Are we unusual in some other way? Be interesting to know that, particularly if we want to try and tease out what the amenities are, if this is part of a competition. But we should have an understanding of what it is people are looking for and how are they making decisions. I suspect that a lot of those people who we're seeing that are now working in Kenmore and working from home, I wonder how many of them came here within the last 5 years versus they were already living here. Did we attract them to Kenmore in some way? If we did, what was it they found attractive? If it went away, what would they find as an incentive to leave? I think those are important questions.
Okay. Any other comments on this topic? All right. So those were the items that I wanted to discuss this evening, the background. But there was one additional. I think this is so exciting. I hope you will be excited. So a couple of you, if not several of you, have in the past asked about interest in the financial implications of various land use patterns. What would be the implication for the city if certain development styles were supported, not supported, etc. So we have been in touch with a person. His name is Joe Minicozy. He is a principal of a firm called Urban 3, and Urban 3 synthesizes land value economics, property and retail tax analysis, and community design. And we've heard about Mr. Minicozy because of a connection to the Strong Towns movement, and you may be aware of that. Chuck Marone, who's the, I think, sort of the founding Strong Towns person, was here and spoke at the city in 2019. And so Joe Minicozy's name came up, and he is available at a cost, of course, but he is available to do a presentation, and we are thinking that that might be really useful. He would talk about the different fiscal impacts of different development types, and he would give sort of a presentation, I don't know, half an hour presentation or something, and then be available to answer questions. And so we are hoping to have this webinar on either April 7th, which is a Wednesday, or April 8th, which is a Thursday. He's not available on that first Tuesday, which is your regular meeting date. He's on the East Coast, so he actually has agreed that he would start his presentation at 9 o'clock his time so that we could make it 6 o'clock Kenmore time. So we're asking about availability on either of those 2 days at 6 o'clock, because we think he has some really interesting information and it would get to some of the questions you have been asking. So I don't know if you are able to make a determination tonight, or maybe some of you can, and we can send a follow-up email, but we want to get on his schedule. He's in high demand. And so we originally were shooting for the March 18th, and by the time one day turnaround, it was already gone. So I'm hoping we can schedule him soon if you have availability.
I can be available either day.
Me too.
Yeah, I'll be around. Yep.
Okay,
The 7th works best for me.
okay.
Or is it
So,
in lieu of our Tuesday meeting, or in addition to?
no, it would be in place of.
Okay, either
So,
day.
so either day for you? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, either day, and one prefers the 7th.
My preference is for Wednesday, but I can do either.
Oh, so that's the 7th as well,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I could do either.
Okay, well, it sounds like what I will try to do is arrange for the Wednesday, which is the 7th, and then maybe everyone would be available. We will be able to record the presentation, so if you can't make it, we will have that recording. And we will, of course, it's a Planning Commission meeting, but anyone can attend, so we will advertise it as a Planning Commission meeting, although only the commissioners would be, I think, able to answer or to ask questions. So, Debbie, do you have anything to add to that? Uh-oh.
No, I think we were trying to, because this question always seems to come up about the cost of land use, and it's not typically a piece that the Planning Commission gets into, but it's sort of one of those consequences or one of those topics that needs to be discovered. So we thought that Mr. Minicozy had a really good approach to this, and might be sort of again, very useful information before you kind of really dive into some of these policy questions around land use.
Sorry, when you said you would promote the meeting, were you thinking of promoting it, even giving it a boost beyond the promotion of normal planning commission meetings with the community? Or just a normal?
Yeah, we haven't really talked about it. Do you think that the general community would be?
I don't know. If it seems like it's a special event for us, and maybe it would be something, a nice way to kind of slowly invite our broader community into the conversation too.
Yeah.
Just through an extra boost of advertising.
Yeah.
Right. As we do with the missing middle panel, I think a couple years ago, right? So.
Yeah.
Yep. So we can kind of, once we have a date nailed down, we can also talk to our public information people in terms of, the best place to put it on the website or out to social media, or if there's any other e-news or anything like that coming up to get the word out.
So I assume that Joe would be talking both about the revenue and expense side of this and its impact on the city. So it would be potential tax and other revenues, fee revenues that would come into the city based upon the type of development versus the cost.
Correct.
One of the things I was just going to ask, I always would prefer to err in the side of being overly inclusive rather than non-inclusive, but I think this is a real valuable opportunity for the commission members to get some questions answered. And given that we're already in fairly into the weeds, there are questions we're going to want to ask that are fairly technical. So I guess I want to make sure that we don't overuse Joe's time and attention and not get to the important questions that we need to get some answers to. So would this be, if this is in lieu of our regular meeting, is this a public meeting where we would have comments from the community? And how do we control and manage that? Or we don't?
So I don't think it would necessarily have to be a standard agenda. We wouldn't have to have approval of minutes and citizen comments, et cetera. It would just be a presentation to the Planning Commission. I think the reason I was talking about who could ask questions is that there may be a broad community interest, but this is designed specifically for commissioners because there are questions that you've raised. And I think it's really important that you have, in a limited period of time, the opportunity to ask your questions. Another thought that I have is that if some of you have specific questions that you know you're going to ask, it would be useful for me to have those in advance. Like if it, by the end of the week, you could send that type of a question to me, then I could help steer the presentation to be sure that we are encapsulating the critical information that you're looking for.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so just to say that again, if you have specific questions and you can get them to me by the end of the week, that will help me frame the conversation. Of course, you can ask your questions at the meeting, that's the whole point, but that would help me prepare with Mr. Minicozy for the presentation.
Okay. Great.
We can also maybe, I think as Laurie said, it is the focus of the Planning Commission, but if we do get a lot of community interest, we can maybe talk to them about the logistics of if there was time to have, questions from the audience, I guess. I don't know how that would work, but, that's also, again, part of the logistics that we'll have to work out.
Okay, that's all I have.
Great. Well, thank you. So anything else for us tonight from anyone? Anybody have any?
Hey, Lori, just to clarify, or just to, make sure that we do everything right. If that does end up being a commission meeting, an official commission meeting, just make sure, we meet all of the criteria for it being a meeting. And I don't know if that means, you know, citizen comments does have to occur at some point. I'm not certain, but if we feel that, you know, maybe citizen comments could kind of incorporate, you know, maybe questions from the audience, maybe putting it at the end after our discussion or something like that, we could kind of combine both things. Anyway, it's something we can discuss later, I guess.
All right, well, anybody else have anything else for tonight? Doesn't look like it. So with that, we'll adjourn the meeting and see everybody in a couple of weeks. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.